Hi everyone, this is Jerry. This is the 12th round of the FIDE World Chess Championship 2010. Both players enter with 5.5 points apiece, and Topalov with the white pieces in this game opens with 1 d4. Anand replies d5. Queen pawn opening c4, and now e6, Queen's Gambit Declined. Knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, so the white knights are developed classically, and black is now opting to just go with the kingside development first and then get castled, and only then worry about the placement of the queenside pieces. So bishop g5, developing the bishop prior to pushing e3 so that the bishop is outside of the dark pawn chain. Now h6, putting a question to the bishop immediately, and now bishop back h4, castle, e3, and now knight e4. One thing that's interesting to note is this insert of h6. You could very well have seen this variation here where black would castle e3 and then knight here. So what's the purpose of first playing this h6 move? Well, it's a long-term idea. What that idea has in mind is to allow a flight square eventually for your own king come the endgame stage. So by playing h6 right now, you're allowing your king to have this h7 square available to him. So bishop back, castle, e3, and only now knight to e4. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, and from here we see rook to c1. If the knight is to be captured here, black can simply recapture, and if white tries to go ahead and grab this pawn, that won't be too successful. For example, knight here could be met with e5, and if this pawn is taken, we just have pawn takes pawn. The queen is hitting the knight, and if the queen recaptures this pawn here and tries to defend the knight, that'll run into rook to d8. The queen is hit, and this knight here will be lost on the next turn. So that's not going to happen. Instead, what we are seeing is just after queen takes bishop, rook c1, followed by c6. This pawn is likely to be subjected to attack since there's already a white rook on the c-file, so it's purposeful to want to advance it to the c6 square so that this b7 pawn could be responsible for defending it, instead of having your own queen tied down to potentially defending your c-pawn. From here, just some developing moves. Bishop e2, preparing to castle. Knight takes knight, rook takes knight, followed by pawn takes pawn and bishop takes pawn. From here, by capturing like this, black is essentially saying, okay, I'm giving up control of the center, but in the meantime, I'm going to have an easier time developing. I could play moves like b6, bishop b7, knight d7, and at some point try and free up my position with either of these sort of pawn moves. These are the two key squares to really be focused on for black. You're either going to want to move this pawn to e5 or this pawn to c5 and break, try and crack at this d4 pawn of whites. So after bishop takes, we see knight d7. Notice that the knight functions quite well, supporting both of these pawn advances. And white castles, and as you might anticipate, since this knight is here, this bishop isn't coming out in this direction, so that's why we're just seeing b6 to allow the bishop come to b7. Bishop d3, focusing on this diagonal here. Its main intention is to just get on this square here and try and put pressure on this pawn immediately. After it moves to d3, the rook is hitting it directly, and the bishop has thoughts of moving to this e4 square to not only attack the pawn but place it in a pin, since the rook here would also be in the bishop's view from this e4 square. So black just avoids any of that possibility, any possibility of this pawn being pinned from this c6 square by playing pawn to c5. Bishop e4 hits the rook, rook to b8, the only move, and now queen c2, just starting to pile up on this c5 pawn. From here, what we see is knight to f6, but it's worth considering why not just take here. Well, that's probably going to run into some serious problems as a result of this knight recapturing, and now with its sights on this c6 square, it's hard to imagine black being in any good shape from such a position. all of the white pieces are focused on this square. This is a hole in the black position, and white is likely to pounce on the black position from here. So that's why we're not seeing pawn takes pawn, allowing the knight to recapture, but instead just knight f6, striking at this e4 bishop. From here, pawn takes pawn, knight takes bishop, queen takes knight, and pawn takes pawn. So something big just occurred here. What we just had was the trade of a knight for a bishop, so that's the current imbalance in the position. In exchange for giving up the bishop, what does white have as compensation? Well, this pawn right now is going to be a target. So is white going to be able to show that, by giving up the bishop, it's going to be worth it? This pawn is definitely going to need pieces watching over it. So from here, right away, just relocating the queen to a square where she's not only now watching over b2, since that was hit, but she's also adding pressure to the c5 point. Bishop b7, just pressuring the knight on f3. You really don't want to allow that sort of thing going on to mess up your kingside pawn structure. So the knight just calmly moves out of the way to d2, and it has thoughts of placing itself on c4, and from that square it can't be chased away by any of the black pawns, and it would act as a very nice outpost for the knight too, since if it is to get to this c4 square, notice that from this square it would be controlling both of these squares. From c4 it'd be controlling b2 and d2, which are going to be entry points potentially for these rooks. You could anticipate the rooks being on d8, this rook already being on b8, possibly getting to these two squares, so the knight from the c4 square will be controlling those two squares quite well. So after knight d2, we see rook to d8, just getting the last piece in play for black, pressure on the knight, and from here we see pawn to f3. Capturing here is no good as a result of just rook takes knight, and well, actually, let me just back up for a second. Taking here is no good because this queen is now in an overloaded state. She's having to do two tasks, and it's just not a good position to be in. That just usually runs into trouble, and it does with just rook takes knight. Black is going to win. So instead, we're seeing f3. What's the point of this move? Well, this bishop, prior to the f3 move, the bishop has direct sight of g2, which is a soft point in the white position. You could potentially see queen coming to g5, adding more fuel to g2. So f3 just acts as, or after rook d8, f3 acts as just trying to blunt this bishop's diagonal, blunt this bishop's pressure at the g2 point. So the bishop just relocates. There really isn't much going on this diagonal at this point right now, so it's just relocating to a new diagonal, striking at f1, and from here, well, not only striking at f1, but also it has sights of coming to d3 at some point. From here, what we do see is rook to f2, opting to try and protect the 7th rank, opposed to making the seemingly more logical move rook to c1, just really piling up on this pawn here. I think Topalov was really starting to anticipate how to cope with his king position. At some point, is he going to be playing h3, g3? How is he going to be safeguarding his king? Because eventually he's not going to want to come here with his king if there's a black rook finding itself on the back rank. So he's going to want to move one of these two pawns. So I'm starting to think, he played this rook to f2 move so that he's watching over 7th rank, opposed to putting more pressure on this pawn here. From here, just simple rook to d7. There really isn't much going on here. This point is not really something that black could look to put pressure on. If there's too much pressure on this pawn here, it could always advance to b3 and be well supported. So it's really just time to get this rook involved. So rook d7 allows the rook to come here, where black would be forming a battery along the d file. And now g3, another interesting point here, because what's the downside with such a move? What exactly is going on with this G3 move? G3 move? Well, it's allowing the king to come to G2. The downside is that it's weakening this F3 square. It's weakening, more specifically, a light square. And when you're doing that, when your opponent has still a light square bishop on the board, that's a little bit iffy, for long-term reasons. Maybe there's not a way to exploit this pawn right away, but maybe at later stages in the game it will become a vulnerability. So why not H3? That may very well be a good question. I'm thinking that as a result of H3, I think, Topalov is maybe anticipating, okay, well, when or if my king does find itself on H2, it can easily be checked. And then he's probably going to have to maybe defend with F4. But when he does that, then the bishop can maybe reroute himself to B7, where G2 would then become, yet again, another sore spot in the white position. Those are just my thoughts. What ends up happening is he just plays G3 from this position. And he's anticipating just kind of tucking his king in on the G2 square and just trying to hold on to this F3 point to try and just secure this F3 point. From here, black just continues with doubling, very logical move. And now king G2 just getting off of this back rank here and just watching over F3 a little bit more, and even H3. H3 wasn't guarded by anything, and H3 is in fact a hole in the white position. Now bishop D3 hits the queen. Where to go to from here? There are a couple options. Both of them, I believe, are relatively equal. What was played is queen C1. If queen A4 instead, I'm not sure what exactly the continuation would be from here. I believe much of the analysis was at this point that it's relatively equal in both scenarios. What we are having is just queen C1 and now bishop back, with maybe ideas of pressing forward at some point with C4, or also maybe just thinking about rerouting this bishop back to this diagonal. Since this G3 push was made, F3 is a sore spot, so you may very well be finding the bishop back on this diagonal to be useful. From here, rook A3 hits the bishop. Bishop B7 gets out of the way, and it's already opposite the white king. Knight B3 starts to pile up on C5. It's now hit twice, and this move right here just loses tactically to just bishop takes pawn check, and then the rook would fall. So knight B3 piling up on C5, and now rook C7 to defend. This is just a very minor point here, but why not place this rook here? Try and find the differences between these two moves. Well, it may turn out to just not make much difference, but if you do move your rook to C8, when the knight comes here and attacks this bishop, and the bishop goes back, notice that this rook from this square is unprotected, and that sometimes leads to bad things for you if you're not well coordinated, or if you have an unprotected piece such as this rook here on C8. However, by playing your rook to C7 in this position, yes, it's functioning, it has its primary function to guard this C5 pawn, but it's also taking into account being coordinated. So in the event of knight to A5, which was played, the bishop simply comes back, and notice that the queen is stringing everything together quite well. In fact, everything from this position is protected, whereas in that other variation with the rook coming to C8, things wouldn't be. Would white be able to exploit that previous position? I'm not so sure, but again, it's just probably better to stay coordinated. So knight C4, not sure what was really accomplished by those moves. The knight came to, from B3 it went to A5 and now to C4. So from C4 it functions quite well. It stops this pawn from ever moving. It has maybe ideas of coming to this square at some point. This knight, unfortunately, is still trying to find a home. There are no holes really in the black position that this knight can really make use of. Whereas this bishop, currently when you do compare these minor pieces where there does exist an imbalance, I believe that black is doing much better. This bishop, although it's on a corner square, it's functioning quite well on this main diagonal. So e4 looks to guard some dark squares, this d4 square, potentially to move forward yet again and maybe influence this pawn in some way. And now e4, allowing this knight to make use of e3, where if it's allowed to get there, it has thoughts of maybe coming to d5 or f5. Again, this knight is still looking for outposts. It would much rather, in my opinion, it would much rather place itself on a square where it's being watched over by a pawn, and to be either on d5 or f5, I believe it's a bit more central than being on this c4 square. There really isn't much time for that, however, with Vishy's next move. f5 immediately starts to undermine this white pawn structure. The end result of something like this is that this bishop's mobility is increased. By removing this pawn and removing this pawn, this bishop is simply granted access to all of these squares along this diagonal. Currently, it's like if you can't get through to this point, you're not going to get to any of these points here that I've highlighted in blue. So by playing f5, you're just trying to make this pawn flinch. And from this position, Topalov flinches. He actually captures, and I believe this is the this is where things start to go wrong for white. I believe better is to just try and do your best here and maintain this e4 point with the move like knight d2, just trying to hang on to this e4 point so that this bishop really can't make use of any of these three squares. But as it turns out, we have e takes f followed by e4. This should not come as a surprise. Really, you're just trying to make all of the white pawns that are on white squares move, and black is doing just that. So this bishop, it's hard to imagine a better diagonal for this bishop to be on. So after e4, pawn takes pawn, and now queen takes pawn. Black is in a very aggressive position, and white king, currently in check, has very few choices. If he goes here, he gets mated. If he goes to f1, this is essentially mate since you're losing the queen. So the only other choice is to move forward, not a direction you want to go in, especially when the ladies are still on the board. Rook to d4. You could chalk a move up like this as, it's repositioning, but the rook was just functioning along a file, but now it's functioning in two directions. So now it's not only a vertical piece, but it's functioning horizontally as well. So it's definitely being put to good use from this d4 square. And the threat now is just to play the queen to g4 and checkmate white. Knight to e3, the only reasonable defense, guarding the g4 square. And now queen to e8, threatening another mate in one. Making use of h4 would deliver checkmate. The white king is unfortunately being caught in a crossfire here. All of these squares are just being controlled. g4, the only defense, and now pawn to h5, trying to yet again eliminate another white pawn that's on a white square. For other reasons besides just increasing this bishop's possibilities. It's really, if you can make this pawn move forward or capture, this rook would then have access to this square here. White has many choices here. I'll just cover a couple. If takes here, it's just queen recapture followed by mate. Or if we saw a move like the pawn advancing here, queen e4 followed by queen h4 would do the trick. But we aren't seeing that. Instead, after h5, it's king h4. Just walking the king a bit closer, maybe trying to get this move in and then secure the g4 point, but there's really not much time for that. Vishy just lashes out with a very forceful move, g5 with check. Pawn takes pawn, and now queen takes pawn, followed by queen to f1, Really, white is in a very tough spot. This pawn is pinned to the king. After this queen to f1, white is just really trying to generate some sort of counterplay from nothing, focusing on this f8 square. Rook takes pawn with check, and if the rook is captured, that'll just lead to mate, so the only choice is king h3. And from here, rook to e7, a very logical move. This rook really wasn't contributing much to the position. It was just kind of staring at their own pawn from c7. So rook e7 hits at this knight. One interesting variation that I saw is that if rook f7 from this position, if rook takes rook from here, would be a nice little finish. Bishop g2 check. Queen takes bishop from here would be the best move, but let's just look at a nice little possible finish. Knight takes would run into rook check, knight takes rook, and queen to g4 mating, while all four of these pieces still remain on the board. Black would win with just the queen. But that didn't happen. Instead, what we do see is just rook e7, again, very logical, just getting this last piece essentially involved and trying to remove this knight for if it leaves, if it's to move off of this square, let's just say goes here, that'll again run into rook check followed by queen to g4 mate. So really the main thread here is to just snip this knight followed by playing rook here and queen g4 mate. So how does white react after rook e7? Rook check, king g7, king h7 would pretty much finish white off as well. There really isn't much to do. If white tries to control this square with the queen, anticipating, the rook capturing the knight, followed by this rook here and queen to g4 type of mate, this is what would happen. Rook takes knight, rook takes rook, well, not bishop check right away, rook check right now. If king takes, queen to g4 is mate, and if queen takes, a really nice finish, bishop mate like that, or pick your favorite, queen mate as well. So that's really just another way that black could have gone about things, but instead of playing to h7, we just see king g7, and from here knight to f5 check, forking the king and rook. We just have king to h7. From here we have rook g3. There's no time to take this rook again because of rook check and mate, so this is the recurring theme as you're seeing. Instead, what we do have is just rook g3 from this point, and now we're going to reach an ending which is unbalanced. There's pretty much these next handful of moves are all forced and end up in a position where it's going to be a queen versus a rook and knight. So rook takes rook. There's only one way to recapture, and it's with the pawn. Capture with the knight, you get mated. So by capturing with the pawn, the king is now has access to h2. Queen check, king h2, the only move. Rook e2 check, king to g1, and now rook to g2 check. This bishop, very deadly from this corner square. The white queen has to give itself up. If you go here, you run into nasty discovered checks. So it's just queen takes rook, bishop takes queen, and now Topalov responds king takes bishop. From here, one interesting thing to note is that if white tried to go ahead and check from this position, you might be thinking, well, I can't go here because of rook check and then I lose my queen, and so I'm going to have to go here. Going here would lose. Not only is it check, you're guarding the rook, you're hitting the queen, so that's definitely not going to happen. If you go here, you might be thinking that this might run into perpetual check. However, that would not be the case, because after bishop takes queen, if white did in fact try to give check, instead of taking the bishop here, if it tried to give check, you simply can make use of g6, and if rook check here, king takes knight. If rook takes queen, this is an important position. You don't take with your king, that'll result in a drawn position. Instead, you take with the pawn, and after the king recaptures the bishop, king here, followed by here, will lead to a win for black. So, we aren't seeing that sort of thing. We aren't seeing at this position this rook check, but instead, king takes bishop, so we have an ending that's unbalanced, a rook and knight versus a queen. One of the main things white is going to be having to do from such a position is keep things coordinated, and that's going to be a difficult task with this exposed white king. So queen check, king to h3, and now a nice move, c4, not grabbing this pawn right away. I'm sure this pawn could be grabbed, and this could translate into a win for black, but you know, there's really no rush in taking this pawn. It's going nowhere. If it's to ever move, this pawn could just advance, and black would be queening soon. Really, the idea here is to maintain this queen's position. You know, by playing here, you're maintaining the queen's position so that this king could never really come over here and start to maybe coordinate things. You know, maybe if the king, for example, if something like this occurred, the king could maybe come here and then here, and maybe there's some perpetual check or something crazy like that. But by maintaining your queen here and playing c4 instead of grabbing here, there's no time for king here because you would get mated. So from the e2, she's watching over this g4 square. So a4, really it's just kind of like I don't have any good moves. Black is essentially putting white in zugzwang. After a5, white is running out of moves. They have to be very careful with how they coordinate things. Again, the exposed king, these pieces have to be coordinated, and it's very, very difficult to do, and may very well just be impossible. So rook f6, as soon as this rook is to, let's say, leave protection of the knight is going to be won. If rook here, this is just one thing to do. Check and win the knight. So the rook is just having to move to a square and still guard the knight. King g8, a move directed at now just trying to guard squares from the rook. White is running out of moves. The king can't go here because of mate, and you know, can't go anywhere else legally besides that. So what we do see is knight check, king g7. The king is hitting both, so now instead of the rook having to guard the knight laterally or along this file, it's having to guard it along this rank here. Queen to e4, this is an interesting position. This king guards these two squares from the knight. You know, these are the only possible 4 squares the knight can go to, and all 3 squares are guarded by the black king and pawn. So rook here, this knight could go to these 4 squares. Black has all 3 of these controlled, so what does queen here do? Well, it watches over that last remaining square that the white knight can possibly make use of. So this is sort of like a position before submission sort of thing going on here. So the other idea with this queen e4 move, not only is it watching here, but it's just threatening queen h1 mate. King h2, really the only reply. And now king to h7, another very calm move. White is simply running out of moves. Rook d6, queen to e5, hitting the rook, hitting the pawn, and also pinning this pawn to the king. If this rook is to move here from this position, we have pawn to h4, and now all of a sudden this diagonal is going to be opened up. The king is going to be exposed to checks. More bad news for white. Instead, what we do see is knight to f7, hitting the queen, defending the rook. Queen takes pawn, king h3, and now queen to g7. And from this position here, Topalov ends up resigning, and for good reason. Eventually, either a knight or rook is going to have to be given up for this pawn here, or we could see moves like queen g4 followed by h4. Again, if this pawn is no longer going to be able to be a shelter for the white king, that's just going to spell disaster. The white or the black queen will at some point be able to fork the white king and the rook, or the white king and the knight. So from this position here, after queen g7, we have the FIDE World Chess Championship going into or turning out to be a win for Anand, and so he retains his title. So that's all for this video. I hope you got something out of it. Take care.